Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Vigiano, the CMO at Fuel Capital. Today, we're so excited to continue our mini-series on SEO. We recently talked to Brendan Baker from Stitch Fix about the fundamentals of SEO. That webinar is now live on the Marketing Toolkit and filed under Growth. In this webinar, I'm excited to talk to Irina to better understand how the content that brands create impacts organic search, how to get a content program off the ground, and how to grow a brand's authority across Google. There's so much to learn, so I can't wait to dig in. First, a little bit about Irina. A physicist turned marketing leader, Irina brings a unique view to her work as a data-driven growth marketing expert. Irina co-founded Galactic Fed to provide clients a better solution for on-demand and scalable growth marketing teams. Previously, she led SEO teams at TopTal, a billion-dollar online services business. Irina's specialty is providing bespoke, highly scalable email marketing and link building solutions, as well as designing and operationalizing full SEO programs at any size and scale for her clients. So Irina, thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Jamie. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
So I got to start with your background because it's so fascinating. You've been a CERN physicist and then a digital marketer. So what's the most surprising similarity between those two fields?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You'd be surprised at how similar they are, actually, because at the very basic nuts and bolts of it, both science and SEO are about looking for patterns, building hypotheses, running experiments, and then making educated guesses. As we're going to go further in detail in our convo today, Google is very much a black box. So as a scientist, any part of physics is also like a black box that you sort of have to tap into and explore using scientific principles. So what really gets me up in the morning with SEO is that feeling that I'm tackling something that is unknown, and then finding ways to, like I said, to look for patterns is very exciting to me. And this sits well with me with my science background. And it's sort of what we've applied a lot to our day-to-day at Galactic Fed.
Fascinating. So you specialize in content development and authority building at Galactic Fed. So let's start there. Can you explain just very fundamentally how content development, SEO, and authority building are all interrelated?
That's a great question. It's a question that, people often ask me, especially because they're always focused on how to build authority. So let's break that down a little bit. So authority is a little bit of a nebulous term in SEO. It basically refers to how Google perceives your brand as a whole, but it's not really possible to measure this directly. However, you'll notice that a few sites do tend to consistently rank in the top results of Google search terms like Wikipedia, Amazon, Quora. And if you're looking for a particular niche, like movie reviews, for example, you're going to get a lot of IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes. Google is a black box. But it's definitely it has patterns that that show preferences for certain websites and certain niches. So I like to think of authority in this sense. In the sense that we can look for patterns where Google has preference for certain websites and certain niches. And how does this tie into developing content? Well, developing content is a major way of building that authority. You want to have pages that rank really well for queries related to your particular brand's industry and speak to your users' needs. And by doing this consistently well over time, you can build up trust with Google that you are truly an authority within your space. Quality content and quality backlinks pointing to that content are the best way to build up your authority over time. And I think that over time, you'll find that Google will rank new pages on your site higher and more quickly since it has already trusted you as a source with plenty of keywords. So if you get that initial foundational content built and manage to get it to rank well, that contributes to an overall lift of the website. Because you've already sort of proven to Google that your domain is a site of authority.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned quality content, and I want to go a bit deeper there because Google essentially defines what good content is. What's the secret there? It is a black box, and I know there's like hundreds of pages of what is defined as good content by Google, but can you walk us through some of the essential elements of what good content is?
Let's talk a little bit how we could define good content. So Google actually has very detailed quality guidelines around good content, which you can find by searching Google Search Evaluator Guidelines. So that's a really helpful thing I wanted to share as a tip. Google that, but the short version is that, quote, good means you have content that has expertise behind it. It is easy to follow, it answers the user's questions, and it meets some basic technical and UX requirements, such as it being mobile friendly, easy navigation, decent page speed, no status code errors, no blocking from robots.txt, meta robots, stuff like that. Provided that you have this checklist in place, that would be how I would define as good content. Now there's a lot more meat in Google's guidelines though, and the details differ depending on the type of page. For example, whether it's an informational article versus a product page versus, something else, a different type of document. But one of the main concepts that I wanted to talk about today is EAT, E-A-T, or expertise, authority, and trust. This is a very big consideration right now in spaces like health and finance, which we deal with a lot at Galactic Fed, because misinformation can lead someone to seriously harm themselves. So Google wants to see, particularly in those spaces, that you can demonstrate expertise and authority on the topic at hand, and that peers in your space trust you. So things like author bios, citations, references, backlinks from established websites, from quality health resources, scientific journals, etc., as opposed to Bob's Health blog. Those things all play into and factor what is quality content, for example, in that space of health and finance. Of course, now, just really quick to sort of summarize, Google is still an algorithm, so it's not really perfect at picking up all of these quality signals. I've noticed that I can still see results in Google sometimes that make me scratch my head a little, like, why is this page ranking higher than this other page? That's better in every conceivable way. This thing still happens, and I'm sure a lot of us have picked up on that from time to time. But nonetheless, Google is getting smarter and smarter every day. So I think for all business owners, it's good to keep Google's ideals in mind and future-proof against updates, since Google's algo is updated all the time.
So I advise a lot of early stage startups, mostly seed, but also Series A, on content programs for the brand, for brand building purposes, but also for SEO purposes. What is your key piece of advice? And I want to start with B2B businesses, because B2C, I think, is a whole new ball game, a whole separate ball game.
Totally, yeah.
I want to talk about B2B businesses and understand what founders need to know to get a content program off the ground for a B2B business. Awesome.
I love talking about this since a lot of the companies I've worked with are actually B2B, particularly B2B SaaS. So I'm going to talk in broad strokes here because this isn't necessarily going to apply to everyone. But in general, for B2B, your target audience is likely to be a very specific sort of decision maker within a company. You're going to need to be very aware of the user intent behind keywords when deciding what you want to target. A common pattern that I've seen with keywords is that the high volume stuff tends to be more basic. That is, it has broader appeal, and most of the searches are coming from people with limited knowledge of whatever the relevant concept is. Because for almost any concept, there are lots of people who know very little and much fewer experts. So if you can grab those high volume keywords, that's cool, but that may not necessarily be getting you in front of the expert decision makers you need to court. When I'm in this position, I often find it helpful to target the really detailed long tail keywords and the industry jargon that the general population may not be familiar with, and craft content around that. So bottom line tip here is, again, very broad stroke, but go after the longer tail, more detailed keywords because that's where you can really develop authority and demonstrate expertise in your specific space.
And is that typically where you start for B2B clients? You actually start with the long tail keywords, or do you start with those with higher volume?
We tried to find a common ground between longer tail keywords that still have some significant high volume, because we see that that's kind of the golden low hanging fruit. Just because so many people try to grab at those shorter tail keywords and do a poor job of it. So.
And where are these brands, once they've identified those longer tail keywords, where are they developing the content? Is it on product pages? Is it the blog? I'd love just very tactically to understand your advice as it relates to where you actually put that content to get the biggest bang for your buck.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. I find that a multi-front war is best here. So particularly for B2B, and again, you really have to identify where your users are asking questions. We find that for a lot of brands, Quora is a great platform. Or Quora, for example, you might find that a CMO is going on there and asking a question like, what is your recommended top marketing product for XYZ? And that question right there is a high intent to buy, highly transactional set of keywords that if you can have your writer put together a very strong authoritative answer, of course, following Quora's regulations of, coming clean that you are affiliated with that brand and product, you stand a good chance of building a really good lead gen strategy. So I'm a big fan of looking at third-party websites. Mm-hmm. To answer your question, third-party websites where there's clearly a lot of important decision makers asking high intent to buy questions, and pair that up with your own particular website, right? Your brand's website, their blog, as another place to show longer form content that answers those very specific expertise questions that can be formed around those longer tail keywords that still have at least 100 a month search volume. Right. Yes.
Okay, got it. So the importance of third-party platforms in building your content engine can't be understated for a B2B business. Go where the decision makers are, which makes complete sense, across any really marketing channel. But I think when we think of SEO, the maniacal focus is how do I juice up my site and the site itself, almost at the expense of other platforms. So I think that's a great piece of advice to understand where the potential customer set may be, where they're seeking out information related to these keywords, whether they're the most prominent or the long tail.
Exactly.
And there as well.
Exactly. Offsite versus onsite SEO. Both are very valid, provided you find the right platforms. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So helpful. Okay. So that was the B2B side. Let's focus on the B2C side. How does everything we just talked about differ for B2C businesses, or does it? I'd just like to understand, how does a B2C business go about developing their content program from step number one? So how do they start?
Totally. So with B2C, it still is going to depend on what type of consumer you're marketing to. But I generally go for a higher volume approach than with what I would do with B2B. Go for a breadth of topics related to the various customer journeys and pain points. Don't get too laser focused on a particular concept, because it can often be unpredictable which content pieces end up taking off. Something else now to also pair that up with sort of addressing on-site versus off-site SEO like we did on B2B side. We found that it's still really helpful to look at additional platforms beyond your brand's website to put content on. For example, I had a recent client who was in the health and fitness space. Their target customers were performance athletes, triathlon runners, marathoners, etc., Ironman athletes. So one of the best platforms to market them was on a site called Strava, which, for anyone who is a big athlete knows is a popular platform for, sort of a community of athletes. So that, that would be sort of what's the apples to apples comparison with B2B and looking at Quora as an option. But similar to B2B, would also want to continue to post quality content on the brand's website under their blog that would also address those really high volume search terms. Again, that are closely tied, and this is the key point, closely tied to the various customer journeys and pain points. This is where that keyword research really is helpful. You don't want to shoot blind at all the different high volume terms that your brand might encompass. You really want to take a step back and ask yourself, how do people discover me? What are the pain points that get them to my doorstep? And really focus on doing the best job possible answering those pain points in your content.
Can we pause on that and talk about,
sure,
on the B2C side, maybe we focus on that fitness brand. What exercises did you go through with them? No pun intended. I just mean like, what,
that was great.
what did you do with them to understand the pain points of the customer journey to get them to that point? Did you have to conduct user research to understand what they were looking for, or did the brand come to you with knowledge of how a person tends to present to a site eventually?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this case, these guys were very well prepared. They had already done their persona research. They already had a list of several, personas that they want to go after, very detailed out, down to what sort of their pain points were. So that was a great starting point for us to dive in and take that information and build keyword research around it. But if we didn't have that in place, we would want to build that from scratch. So we'd want to ask ourselves questions like, let's imagine that we're building a supplement. We would want to understand sort of who are we targeting? There's a very big difference between the pain points of a armchair athlete and a triathlon runner.
Right.
For each of these guys, sort of what is it that stands out in the space? The supplement space has literally thousands of competitors. What makes your particular brand stand out above the rest? What is making it special? That's really the number one question that you need to ask yourself in the B2C space. What is making your brand different from the rest? Because once you have a good answer to that, you can then figure out how that impacts the pain points of your personas. And with that in mind, you can then figure out, looking at the different platforms, different communities online, where, the particular personas could be hanging out. Then you can start targeting specific questions that might be posted there. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
And I would say many of the brands I work with do that persona work and understand the journey. So I think it's incredible. Most think of it as, how do I talk to customers? But I think it's really important to understand what content you need to develop, what questions, essentially all you're doing is saying, what questions am I answering for these customers, right? And
exactly.
That's through content. Okay, so helpful. So on the B2C side, when you're working with a client, how much or what percentage of time would you say content development is spent for on-site versus off-site? Is there a magic formula? Is it wholly dependent on the customer and the brand?
That's a really good question. I would say this comes down to what your business goals are. So, SEO is 100% built on top of business development goals. So let me explain a little more what I mean. If, for example, you're marketing a B2C app, then almost certainly the website is not nearly as important as the app store links, right? So there, I would probably say that more than 50% of your content development time might be spent on third-party platforms, on spiffing up your app store profiles, on generating as much buzz as you can around your app. And that might not necessarily mean that you're going to be investing that much in your site's content.
Right.
However, if your site is a very important standalone site and your goal is to bring as much traffic as you can to it, that's a different story entirely. In that case, at least 50 to 60% of your content development, I would say. Again, this is talking in very broad strokes, but the overwhelming majority of your content would be built around your website. Right. Which of course you can then recycle. Content is content, so you can take that and you can still create additional content off of it that you can then post on third-party platforms. Totally. But the best content should always sit on your site if the goal is to drive traffic to your site, because you are trying to build your site up as a source of authority.
Authority, right? Yeah, makes complete sense. Before we move off of the B2C, and this is something that we weren't planning to talk about, but something that is fundamentally important to app-based businesses. How do you optimize for search, or what are your like top 3 pieces of advice for apps in the App Store and optimizing for search? What are a few things brands can do to make sure that, you know, they're ranking in any App Store search?
Totally. So the first thing where I would always start with this is a very, very deep competitor research. Take a look at your competitors and how they're putting together their profiles. That's step 1. So, you know, and be creative with what you define as a competitor, especially with brands that are targeting multiple niches. They might have competitors in each particular niche that are very different from each other. So don't hold back when you put together your list of competitors. More is better in this case. And for every single one of those competitors, look at their profiles, study what keywords they include on their profiles. Go beyond just looking at the keywords. Look at what type of persuasive language they use. Look at how they present the authority of what they do and what they offer. And then, you know, you should have on your team, and we'll go into more detail on this later, but you should have on your team at least a domain expert, and then also a writer, ideally both in one person, who will then be able to study this web of varying copy that is your competitor's copy, and essentially looking at your particular brand, build something better. While also keeping in mind the SEO do's, which include making sure that you have the right keywords in place, you know, the checklist that we commonly refer to when we optimize any type of content for SEO. But I can't stress how important it is to look at the very top fold of that profile. You know, oftentimes readers do not go beyond the top fold. And what I mean by that is, once you've scrolled, you've lost most of your audience. So what you have in the very top fold of your App Store profile, that is the most important part of your profile, and you want to really make it shine. Never hold back on including quality images, links, a great opening paragraph that really draws you in and speaks to your needs and your key pain points and your buyer's journey. All of that has to be included in the top fold.
All right, you started to allude to this, but the next big thing when it comes to SEO programs and content development is, how do you staff it? Because it's a huge lift, and it's very daunting, incredibly daunting, particularly for young brands to even get going. So totally. I love your advice on how do you staff an organization to take on the work of both on-site, off-site content development optimized for search.
Totally. So I'm going to actually break this down into 2 parts, human resources and then non-human resources. So for human resources, I think at a minimum, you should have any brand. This goes for B2B, B2C, anyone. You should at the minimum have a domain expert. This person should know your domain inside out, be a true expert. And they have
domain, I'm sorry to interrupt. By domain, you mean market, right?
Exactly. So for example, if your company is, I don't know, building a very, very technical product having to do with fisheries, you're going to want somebody in your company who is an absolute bona fide domain expert on that topic. Like, they are the person who would sit in the panel as an expert witness and talk about it. So this person is going to play so many roles in your content development process. They're going to be the final reader of every piece of content you create. Ideas might germinate from them for future pieces that need to be considered. They might be written, they might be the author, or at least the contributing author, or the reviewer of every piece. Additionally, you need to have on your team a solid writer. And this writer is going to be not just a great writer, but a great researcher. So they need to be able to capture the voice of your domain expert. And even if they come into the project not knowing a darn thing about fisheries, they have that research backbone in them that enables them to learn quickly and adopt that voice and structure. Now, in the best case scenario, you're going to find a domain expert who's also a great writer and researcher. And then you've got an all-in-one solution, one person who can handle this. Next to that, ideally, you'll have a designer for visual assets and layouts, a developer for implementation, and a marketer to consult with, depending on which channels you're tailoring your content to.
For the domain expert, for young companies, do you typically see that is the founder or somebody on the founding team who can play that role, and then they just supplement with somebody who can play that researcher/writer role?
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right. Especially when it's a really, really, really tiny, pre-seed funding company. It might literally have 3 people on the team. Yes, the domain expert is likely one of the founding members, and that's totally fine. We want to, of course, remove them from that responsibility over time. So as the company grows, then, ideally you would have somebody else handling that, so the founder isn't the blocker in the day-to-day. But yeah, initially that's often what we see, and it's totally fine. And the writer can then help save them a lot of time by interviewing them. They could be like standalone interviews where you don't even have to meet up with them. You can literally share a Google Doc with questions, or the domain expert might provide the writer with an outline, a very brief outline of what the piece should look like. And then the writer comes in, and because they are a creative researcher, they can grab that outline and flesh it out into a full animated piece.
Right.
Yes.
And where have you found success finding those writers and researchers? Do you have a go-to place to find writers?
I wish I could say that I do, but this depends so heavily on the space, Jamie. I think that some of the less technical spaces like fashion or, parts of wellness and beauty, those are easier to fill just because the barrier to entry is a lot lower. At this point, we're at a place where I'm a very referral friendly person. I find, strangely enough, that really great writers happen to know other really great writers, especially if you're working with a writer who's been in the industry for at least 5 years.
Right.
Almost certainly they're going to know at least 3 or 4 other amazing writers to refer. So as much as possible, I would stray away from blindly going out and trying to recruit off of whatever freelancer platform you choose. I would personally go more for a referral based approach. Now, when it comes to the more technical niches, like that fishery example I shared, there I look at very specific forums or very specific directories or online communities where somebody with that background might exist, and it's a recruiting puzzle at the end of the day. Because you need to find somebody ideally who can speak with authority to that subject.
Right.
So those can get a little trickier, but I just want to share the valuable thing I've noticed. Like, writers do refer other writers, and before you tap in and try to find one yourself, ask the best writers if they have anyone to refer.
Yeah, great piece of advice. Okay, I interrupted. I think you were going to talk about designers as well.
Totally. Yeah. So yeah, just wanted to complete the puzzles there. So beyond the writing, you also want to make sure you have the design and dev component. So having a designer, a developer. From my experience, it's hard to find a person who can do both. really, really well. And you don't want to shoot for generalists here. You want to shoot for real experts. So I recommend finding a top-notch designer who does that really well and a top-notch developer who does that really well, instead of trying to find one person who does both. And then, of course, a marketer to consult with, depending on the channels you're tailoring your content to.
Right.
I just wanted to say that you don't necessarily need a huge writing team, especially when you're talking about smaller companies getting off the ground. You really don't. I've personally seen brands get significant traffic with just a few thoughtfully written articles. You really just need them to be mindful of best practices and write content that's better than what's already ranking on Google for your target keywords. And for that to happen, you often don't need more than one writer and one domain expert. So those are the human resources. I can jump in now and talk a little bit more about the non-human resources.
Yeah, please do.
I'd like to give a shout out to Ahrefs. This has been by far my go-to resource for keyword research. I know there's a lot of other tools out there that are also pretty great, but I freaking love Ahrefs. It's just great to have a keyword research tool of some sort, regardless. It's a necessity to create a strategy around SEO, because you need to know what keywords people are plugging into Google. Otherwise, you really don't have good data on what to create content around. And no, I don't work for Ahrefs. I just really like Ahrefs. Just full disclosure.
Just giving them a shout out. Yeah.
Yes.
I want to go a bit deeper on some specific topics like link building and press. Is there like a critical mass of backlinks that you need, whether it be from press or other websites, that really does make a difference in terms of your site's authority?
My answer to that is absolutely. Like, don't ever hold back. Especially if your brand is mentioned in a piece, you have every right to request a link pointing back to your site. Like, you literally are mentioned in that piece. This is a common link building strategy. In fact, it's called unlinked mentions. So, we'll go into more detail on link building in a second, probably. But this is already considered a common strategy within link building. Looking up every possible mention on the internet of your brand, like putting together a list of keywords that are branded keywords, and then trying to find websites that mention those keywords. Like, for example, I'm just going to make up a random thing. I like the fisheries example. So Bob's Fisheries is your brand, and you want to find every piece of PR out there, any type of article that has ever mentioned Bob's Fisheries. So you put together a list of that. I know there are some tools out there that can help you do this. I believe Mention is one of them. If my source might be a little dated here, but I know I used that a couple of years back. Put together that list of URLs that mention Bob's Fisheries, and then look up their email addresses for every single URL. Put together an email campaign where you reach out and mention to them, hey, thank you so much for writing this piece that mentioned us. I'm representing Bob's Fisheries, and I just wanted to ask you if you would be so kind as to link back to us. And that is a thing that is 100% legit and recommended.
And there's some publications that have a policy against linking back to sites. I can't think of any off the top of my head. But there are some news publications that have a policy against doing so. But I love this huge push of like every mention that you've ever gotten and doing this big push and outreach to ask.
The worst you can get is a no.
No. Or no. Yeah, right.
Or no answer, which is still a kind of a no. But I mean, it's completely inconsequential. So I would absolutely push hard and see what you get. Even if you have 100 unlinked mentions to Bob's Fishery, you might get 10 links. And that's already a win in our book. So yeah, totally.
Interesting. I always deal with it on a one-off scenario, but like in the aggregate, it makes a difference. So it could, it definitely could have an impact if you go retrospectively and ask people to link to the site.
Yes. And it might look a little weird, reaching out to someone who wrote about Bob's Fisheries 15 years ago. So exercise a bit of caution there. grab the, stuff that's more recent, because you might get a couple of weirded out responses otherwise, which you want to try and avoid. So, yeah.
So I jumped into link building, but perhaps I should take a step back and just define the importance of link building.
Totally.
And, we talked about how you go about doing it, but why is that so important in this content development strategy and SEO strategy?
Totally. So I'm going to assume zero knowledge here and just talk a little bit about link building, if that's cool. Yeah. So link building is the act of getting other domains to publish links to pages on your website. For SEO, the main goal of getting these links is to convince Google that you are recognized by other authorities in your space and are worthy of attention. These links basically act as a vote of confidence from one site to another. You can almost think of links as votes in a political campaign. The more of these votes you have from quality websites, the brighter you shine in Google's eyes when they consider how to rank your page. And links are as old as, they come from the land before time in SEO. Some of the top link builders in our space were literally building links in the mid-90s. So as long as the internet exists and pages link between each other, links are going to remain one of the main ranking factor in Google's algorithm, and it's not going to change anytime soon. Now, the value of links has changed a lot over Google's history. And I think we should spend a bit of time talking about that. It used to be that you could literally spam links in forums, directories, throw away websites, and get value from them. This was the Wild West era that ended probably over a decade ago. Google has since made a lot of changes to the algorithm to better detect what it calls link building schemes. And the reason I put that in quotes is because that's a really important term that I recommend our audience to search. If you Google link building schemes, you'll actually get a great page from Google's webmaster blog that cites their policy towards link building schemes. That is really important to consider when you're earning links. So Google looks for link building schemes, and it devalues links that are not earned. So in other words, people who pay for links are committing the ultimate sacrilege of doing link building schemes. You have to earn the link. Just like with PR, you are earning the right to have a high quality website post that content.
Quick question on that, because I know some of the review sites will penalize you if you have this bolus of activity all at once. So let's say you have like 200 reviews on a particular day. You'll get flagged. If you do this activity of you go retrospectively and reach out to all these sites with Bob's Fishery, will Google be like, wait a minute, what just happened? Why did we just get 10 backlinks in the period of 2 days? Like, is Google smart enough to detect the immediacy of?
That's a great question. That is a great question. So this is tied to content velocity versus link velocity. Let's talk about that. So great point. I'm really glad you brought that up. So for example, let's imagine Bob's Fisheries has 5 blog articles, and then you go crazy gung-ho and you earn a lot of links. You earn like 1 million links. I'm just going to be ridiculous in these numbers to prove my point. 5 articles, 1 million links. Definitely this is going to look weird. It's going to look like some sort of scheme happened, and you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that the rate at which you're producing content naturally and directly correlates with the rate at which you're earning links. Okay. Similarly, if you had 1 billion articles on Bob's Fishery blog, but you only had 2 links pointing to them, this would, again, look at Google weird, because it would indicate that your content sucks. Nobody wants to share it.
Right.
Exactly. So link building schemes are a big deal, and we want to always make sure that, again, this comes back down to writing great articles that people actually want to read and share. As long as you do that, as long as you maintain neutrality in those pieces, you don't want to have articles that are full of product placement. You don't want to have articles that are all about your brand. You want to, in fact, minimize that. You want to have informational pieces that solve people's problems and speak to their needs. And if you can do that, you're going to, by the merit of your articles, earn links. A link builder is very much like a matchmaker. Their job is to matchmake the content with the site that actually would benefit from it, who has an audience who would enjoy reading it and gain value from it. And that's where the idea of earning links comes in. So it's really important, for anyone listening out there who got used to some of the tactics that used to work perhaps a decade ago. We don't want to do any type of hacky tactics. We don't want to buy any links. A lot of agencies and a lot of link builders out there still do pay for links. It's still a very common practice. So the number one thing you want to ask yourself when you are working with a link building agency is, do you pay for links? And you can usually quickly figure that out depending on how they price their links. Higher prices usually equate to them paying for links, because not only do they have to get their cut for the work that they're putting in for earning links, but they also have to pay that third party some amount of money to place the link.
Right.
Thus explaining the higher price. So
right.
That's usually a quick way that you can figure out if that's going on behind the scenes.
Interesting. So fascinating. I love this. Make sure the rate that you produce content is consistent with the rate of which you're getting links. It will be flagged to Google if any of those things are out of whack. So I think that was really good advice.
You want to definitely pace things out over time. There's no rush, especially if you find 1,000 mentions to Bob's Fisheries. You can easily pace those campaigns out over half a year or even a year. Right. And it won't make much of a difference in terms of, but it will make a big impact in how Google views your growth.
Yeah, totally. One thing that, as you were saying, this was flagged in my mind, when we think of earned media versus paid placements in traditional media, does Google, draw a discrepancy between those two? Like, it knows that you paid for an article on, it's some paid content on some news site versus an actual earned piece on a Forbes or a Fortune or a New York Times. Like, does Google flag those as less authoritarian?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you are doing earned editorial link building, which, let's just be clear in defining that, those are the most valuable links you can possibly get, is an earned editorial link. Those links are going to be do follow links. This is a tag that you can look up by right-clicking any hyperlink on the internet. So when you right-click a hyperlink, you can inspect the element, and then you can see there if it's do follow or no follow. Do follow is a tag that tells Google, follow this link, counted in your evaluation of the authority of this website. No follow links are all over, like forums, like Wikipedia, any of these wiki type sites. Those are all no follow links because Google doesn't want to create this competitive atmosphere on these websites. They want to just have quality information. So to answer your question, any type of paid placement out there almost certainly is going to be a no follow as a best practice. We don't want to create any ambiguity to Google that these are earned for the sake of link building. Those have a different purpose in mind, probably more related to PR.
Got it. Okay, really interesting stuff I did not know.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it is. It's a whole world out there.
It's a whole world.
You never learn in college.
No, that's for sure. And I didn't learn. I mean, I used to do this in practice, and I didn't even know that. So, okay, so let's talk about user-generated content like reviews and the importance of those in a content program. So, how should a brand think about user-generated content when it comes to their content program in SEO?
Totally. Yeah, this is a question that I think we need to go quite deep into. So bear with me here. So user-generated content can be very valuable, especially if you're in a niche that has robust communities on sites like Reddit or Quora, like that example I gave earlier of the supplement company. Or B2B. A lot of B2B SaaS is going to have that. This is a very different type of content. So user-generated content is a very different type of content than what we've been talking about, though, since it's A, hosted externally, and B, you don't have control over it.
Right.
Having an active presence in these communities is a great way to stoke conversation and build awareness of your brand. So I just wanted to outline first, the main sort of benefit of this is stoking awareness of your brand. From an SEO perspective, user-generated content is also really helpful, as these types of sites frequently rank in the top spots for long-tail Google queries. And by actively participating, you can sometimes claim those top spots with your own posts. So that's my take on user-generated content. Now, let's talk about reviews. Reviews are a whole other beast. Obviously, you want to encourage positive reviews as much as possible. But aside from having a quality product and prompting users that are likely to leave good reviews to leave a review, you don't have a ton of control. What I think is very important is to respond to reviews, especially negative ones, whenever you can. This is something we've noticed time and again with our clients, and we actively encourage them to do. How you address a user's complaint says a lot more about your proactiveness and willingness to rectify problems than if you hide in silence, behind silence. So doing this, you can even make a positive impression from negative reviews. I think a lot of us are jaded about review sites due to the prevalence of companies that post 5-star reviews under their own sock puppet accounts, which you absolutely shouldn't do as a brand. So critical reviews are a sign of authenticity, and we seek these out. And we also look as potential customers at how a brand handled them. So as a business owner, I strongly advise you to seek those out as well and show that you're making every effort to help users with their problems and are constantly bettering yourself and your product.
Yeah. I mean, I remember spinning up various accounts while at TaskRabbit, and we would have like a TaskRabbit DC, a TaskRabbit Orlando for like every city we were in, and just managing all those accounts and the reviews and the replies, and like it was just this beast.
Sounds like a storm.
Yeah. So I don't advise that. I think that actually a great piece of advice is create the social media channels or create a presence on a third-party platform, knowing your ability to manage them, because you can be you can be very liberal in the early days, being like, yeah, let's create all the accounts and all the profiles that we want, but actually in practice, managing them, responding to users across these platforms is a beast. It's a full-time job. So
yes, it is. It really is.
Yeah.
And it scales and snowballs beyond our control sometimes.
Very, very quickly, and know that any profile you put out there is a profile that is opening a conversation to users. So no, you're going to have to stay on top of that. That was one mistake in the early days of TaskRabbit, and I still have nightmares from it. And I'm still admin to those pages on Facebook. I should let TaskRabbit know that I'm still the admin. So
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
And I'm with you on the SEO nightmares. I still get night terrors sometimes from some of those early lessons learned. So it happens.
Yes.
But you live, you learn.
Yes. Only create the accounts that you can manage. Okay. So I'd love to end by talking about metrics, particularly around focusing in on the metrics that really matter when it comes to content building and SEO. And if there's any difference, or how we should think about this for on-site content versus off-site content.
Totally. All right, I'm going to go deep on this. So bear with me here. So ultimately, the metric that really matters is revenue. We all know this, we can't hide this. As much as it's hard to track on SEO side sometimes. It can be a very long journey from consuming the first piece of content to buying, though. So it's necessary to look at top of funnel metrics to assess what's likely working and what's not. So let's start there. So from an SEO perspective, non-branded clicks are usually pretty instructive. These are clicks to your site from any terms that are agnostic to your brand. So they don't contain your brand name. They don't contain any of your unique product names, your CEO's name, or anything like that. These clicks will indicate that people are actually discovering you through Google search, not just using Google as a convenience to navigate to your homepage.
Right.
Now, building up Google search rankings can take weeks or months, though. In our experience, even starting a big campaign could easily take at least 6 to 8 months before we see this metric moving significantly. So to set expectations, this is what we typically advise and set expectations around with our clients. So you can also look at non-branded impressions and their rankings for individual keywords as a very early indicator of growth, particularly in the first 6 months of running a campaign. One thing I'd like to discourage is opening up Google Search Console and just looking at your site-wide average position. Average positions can be misleading when you have a large group of keywords averaged together. So don't fall into that trap. For example, say you have a core group of keywords that you rank for, and you've just gained a new keyword at something like rank 80, since you generally start low and you work your way up. Even if all of your core keywords maintained exactly the same positions, your average ranking just went down because of this one new keyword that you didn't rank well for yet. Right. So when you're expanding your site with new content, it's not uncommon to see average positions go down, even as organic traffic goes up. So bottom line, I recommend in the first 6 months looking at really top funnel metrics like non-branded impressions. Probably months 3 to 4 plus, you can start to look at movement and non-branded clicks. If you're running an aggressive link building and content campaign, you can expect to start seeing improvements in average positions after about 6 months for specific pages that you've been earning links to.
One question I get asked a lot is, where do I host my content? Or excuse me, where do I host my blog? Should I host it on my site, or should I use the third-party platform like a Medium to host my blog content? Now, I've gotten into battles with engineering teams about this because of the lift to actually put it on site. It is an effort. I get it. But I would say articulating an argument for why it's so important to have on site was difficult for me. So I love to hear the pros and cons of hosting your blog content on your website directly or using a third-party platform.
Before I get started with this, I want to say that I too fight many battles on this front. You are not alone in this. We literally get at least one of these a week. So it's great that you asked this question, Jamie, because I would love to contribute here and answer. It's sometimes a little bit of a pain in the ass to set up a blog, but let's talk about why that's a huge benefit. So I almost always suggest hosting your blog on your site. Let's start with that. You control the branding, you control the navigation, and most importantly, you build the authority of your domain as your content gets backlinks and gets shared around the web, as opposed to building Medium's authority. Whenever Medium posts content on their site, you're improving their SEO, which is completely the opposite of what we're trying to do most of the time. So it's possible that you can get some earlier initial readership by taking advantage of a third-party platform who has an existing authority and user base. But I don't see that as a long-term strategy, and SEO is a long-term play. So to wrap up my answer here, start by posting content on your proprietary domain and blog, and then use sites like Medium to expand the reach of your content. Typically, I would post it on the blog first and wait maybe 2 or 3 days, and then you can repost and syndicate on a site like Medium.
And is it a brand account on Medium, or is it a founder account on Medium? What is it? Does it matter?
Good question. I would prefer a brand account just because brands are timeless. And I like to usually stray away from an individual focused approach here. But this again will depend largely on what that brand is. If the brand is literally a personal brand, then obviously my answer would not work out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that was my argument a lot of the times, which was it's a long-term play. If we're going to put in the effort of developing this content, I would love for it to reside on the site so we actually see the impact of it down the line. And then, you know, the feedback I got back was it's a heavy lift and you have the readership of a Medium already built in. and you can get up and running really quickly with an audience. And I think the whole point is we're playing the long game here. SEO is the long game. Brendan Baker said, and I think it's brilliant. He's like, this is like your 401k. You're making an investment into SEO, but you need part of a marketer's job is to convince the rest of the organization that this is in the benefit of the company for the long term. So I think
well said.
And I think those arguments that you said, which are, if we're going to put in this effort, we need to reap the rewards down the line. And I'm not giving the rewards to Medium. I much rather get the rewards to the brand itself. So yeah, really, really important, and battles that marketers face every single day. So
totally. I'm glad we've put up our bloody armor now in peace.
Yes. We don't come to make war. We're trying to make peace, but we need your help. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, awesome. Well, this was so incredibly enlightening. I am a lot smarter after chatting with you.